He thought he was simply rescuing a stranger from a cruel fate. But that night in the saloon would change the course of an entire town. The choices he made in the bitter cold would spark a fight against power, injustice, and hopelessness. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The winter of 1878 had been particularly harsh in the small mining town of Redemption Creek, Colorado. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape, and the biting wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden buildings lining the town's only street. James Miller, a 35-year-old former Union soldier turned doctor, pulled his worn coat tight around his shoulders as he made his way from his modest clinic toward the saloon. The Golden Nugget was the only establishment still illuminated at this late hour. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp smell of cheap whiskey. James wasn't much of a drinking man, but after losing another patient, a young miner crushed in a cave-in, he needed something to dull the edges of his failure. "Evening, Doc," greeted Samuel, the bartender, sliding a glass across the counter. "Rough day?" James nodded, taking a sip of the amber liquid. "Lost Tommy Winters today. Nothing I could do." Samuel shook his head solemnly. "That's the third miner this month. The Blackwell Mining Company works those boys too hard, with too little regard for safety." As James nursed his drink, the saloon doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air. Several men entered, pushing a woman ahead of them. She was thin, her dress torn and dirty, her face bruised. She stumbled, falling to her knees. "Got ourselves some entertainment, boys," announced Frank Blackwell, the mine owner's son. "Found this one trying to steal food from our storehouse. Thought she might be more useful here." The woman, who couldn't have been more than 25, kept her eyes downcast. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, partially obscuring her face, but James could see the defeat etched in her features. $7 for anyone who wants a turn with her," Frank declared, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her to her feet. "She ain't much to look at, but beggars can't be choosers in this weather." Something in James's chest tightened. He'd seen plenty of cruelty during the war and in the years since, but there was something particularly disturbing about the empty look in the woman's eyes. It wasn't fear or anger, it was resignation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the saloon patrons. "Just make it quick." Frank laughed, shoving her toward the crowd. "Hear that, boys? She's eager." Before James fully realized what he was doing, he was on his feet, fishing in his pocket for money. "I'll take her," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. Frank raised an eyebrow. Well, the good doctor's got urges like the rest of us after all." James laid $7 on the table, more money than he could truly spare. "Come with me," he said to the woman, his voice gentle but firm. She followed without resistance, her eyes still downcast, as if preparing herself for whatever indignity awaited her. The men jeered as James led her out of the saloon, suggestions and crude comments following them into the night. The cold air hit them like a physical force as they stepped outside. The woman shivered, her thin dress providing little protection against the elements. Without a word, James removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "I'm taking you to my clinic," he said, guiding her through the snow. "You're safe now." She finally looked up at him, confusion and suspicion warring in her hazel eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Because it was the right thing to do," James replied simply. They walked in silence, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. The clinic was dark when they arrived, but James quickly lit a lantern and stoked the embers in the small stove to bring warmth back to the room. "I'm James Miller," he said, gesturing for her to sit on a chair near the stove. "I'm the doctor here." She hesitated before sitting, still eyeing him warily. "Sarah," she finally offered. "Sarah Bennett." "You're hurt, Sarah," James said, noticing the cuts and bruises more clearly in the lantern light. "Will you let me tend to your injuries?" Sarah tensed but gave a small nod. As James gently cleaned the cut on her cheekbone, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't stealing. I was hungry, and they had so much food. I thought—" She trailed off, wincing as he applied antiseptic to her wound. "You don't need to explain yourself to me," James assured her. "No one deserves to be treated the way they treated you. Where I'm from, doctors don't waste their time or money on women like me," Sarah said, studying his face. James continued his work, applying a small bandage to her cheek. "And what kind of woman is that?" "The hopeless kind." James finished tending to her visible wounds, then stood and walked to a small chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a clean shirt and a pair of trousers. "These will be too big, but they're clean and warm," he said, handing them to her. "You can change behind that screen. There's a cot in the back room where you can sleep tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Sarah accepted the clothes with trembling hands. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" James shook his head. "Nothing. Sometimes people just help each other, Sarah. That's all there is to it." As she disappeared behind the screen to change, James stared out the frosted window at the silent, snow-covered town. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to intervene tonight, but looking at the bruised and battered woman changing into his clothes, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, at least one person in Redemption Creek might sleep a little easier. The morning light filtered through the clinic's frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. James had slept poorly, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. He dozed off in his chair, not wanting to disturb Sarah by moving to his own quarters. He rose quietly and added wood to the stove, bringing the room back to a comfortable temperature. As the coffee began to boil, he heard soft footsteps behind him. "I thought you might have left," Sarah said, standing in the doorway of the back room. In the daylight, her injuries looked even worse, purplish bruises contrasting starkly against her pale skin. "This is my clinic," James replied with a small smile. "Where would I go?" "I meant ... Sarah hesitated. "I thought you might have expected me to be gone." James poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "I hoped you wouldn't leave without at least having breakfast." She accepted the coffee cautiously. James noticed her hands were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life. "I don't have much," he continued, "but there's bread and some preserves. You should eat something." As they shared the simple meal, James studied Sarah more carefully. Beyond the bruises and exhaustion, he could see intelligence in her eyes and a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. "Where are you from, Sarah?" he asked gently. She took a moment before answering. "Boston, originally. My father was a carpenter. When he died, there wasn't much left for my mother and me. She passed last year from consumption." Sarah's voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion, as if speaking about someone else's life. "I came west with a man who promised me work in Denver. The work wasn't what he described." James nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. "And how did you end up in Redemption Creek?" "I ran, kept running until I couldn't anymore. The winter caught me here." She looked down at her coffee. "I've been sleeping in the stables when I could, doing whatever work I could find. Then the snow got worse, and the work dried up." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. James opened it to find Martha Wilson, the schoolteacher, standing with a basket in her arms. "Good morning, James. I heard what happened at the saloon last night." Her eyes moved past him to Sarah. "I thought you both might need some proper food." Martha was one of the few people in town James considered a friend. She was a widow in her 40s who had come west to start anew after losing her husband in the war. "That's very kind, Martha," James said, accepting the basket. "Please, come in." Martha entered, setting the basket on the table. "I'm Martha Wilson," she said to Sarah, offering her hand without hesitation. "I teach at the schoolhouse." Sarah shook her hand tentatively. "Sarah Bennett." "Well, Miss Bennett, I've brought some fresh bread, eggs, and a stew that should last a couple of days." Martha turned to James. "And I've spoken with Reverend Thompson. He agrees that the spare room at the church would be a suitable place for Miss Bennett to stay until she decides what she wants to do next." James glanced at Sarah, who seemed overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "That's generous of the Reverend." "This town has its share of hard men," Martha said, her voice taking on an edge. "But there are good people here too. What Frank Blackwell did was despicable, and not everyone is willing to turn a blind eye to such behavior." The mention of Blackwell's name caused Sarah to tense visibly. "He'll be looking for me," she said quietly. Martha's expression hardened. "Let him look. The church is neutral ground, even for the Blackwells. Their money may own the mine and half the businesses in town, but they don't own all of us." As Martha spoke, another knock came at the door, this one heavier, more insistent. James opened it to find Sheriff Donovan standing on his porch, looking uncomfortable. "Morning, Doc," the sheriff said, his eyes darting past James to the women inside. "Need a word with you." James stepped outside, pulling the door partially closed behind him. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Donovan lowered his voice. "Frank Blackwell's raising hell about you interfering with his property. Last night, says you stole from him." "I paid his asking price," James replied coldly. $7 for a human being. If anyone should be facing questions, it's Blackwell for treating a woman like chattel. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his weathered face. "Look, Doc, we both know the Blackwells practically own this town. The mines employ most of the men here. I can't afford to make enemies of them. So you're here to take her back?" "I'm here to warn you," Donovan said. "Keep her out of sight for a few days. Frank's pride is hurt more than anything. If he doesn't see her around, he'll likely move on to his next amusement." James studied the sheriff's face. Donovan wasn't a bad man, just a practical one caught between duty and survival. "Martha's arranging a room for her at the church." Donovan nodded. "That's good. Reverend Thompson's one of the few people in town the Blackwells won't openly cross. Just ... Be careful, Doc. This town needs you more than it needs another martyr." After the sheriff left, James returned inside to find Martha and Sarah deep in conversation. "The sheriff was warning me to keep you out of sight," he explained. "It seems Frank Blackwell is feeling slighted." Martha stood, straightening her skirt. "All the more reason to get Miss Bennett settled at the church right away. I'll take her through the back alleys. We'll attract less attention that way." As Sarah prepared to leave with Martha, she paused by the door, turning to James. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You don't need to," he replied. "Just take care of yourself. I'll check on you later today to make sure those wounds are healing properly." After they left, James sat alone in his clinic, the events of the past 24 hours weighing heavily on his mind. He had helped one woman escape a terrible fate, but he couldn't ignore the larger problem. The Blackwells' influence over Redemption Creek had grown increasingly oppressive, and too many people suffered under their control. For years, James had focused solely on healing physical wounds, avoiding the deeper sicknesses afflicting the town. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "Where I'm from, doctors don't waste their time or money on women like me ... The hopeless kind." Perhaps it was time to challenge that hopelessness, not just for Sarah, but for everyone in Redemption Creek who had forgotten they deserved better. 3 days passed with relative calm. James visited Sarah at the church daily, checking her injuries and bringing small comforts, a book from his personal collection, a jar of honey from Widow Johnson's bees, a warmer shawl borrowed from Martha. The bruises on Sarah's face were beginning to fade, changing from angry purple to a softer yellowish hue. With each visit, James noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She held herself straighter, met his gaze more readily, and even offered small smiles when he shared news from town. The defeated woman from the saloon was slowly giving way to someone with a quiet strength that impressed him. On the 4th morning, as James prepared his medical bag for house calls, the clinic door burst open. Martha rushed in, her normally composed face flushed with urgency. "There's been an accident at the mine," she said breathlessly. "A tunnel collapse. They're bringing the injured to the town hall. It's the only space large enough." James grabbed his bag and followed Martha into the street. The usual quiet of the morning had been shattered by shouting and the sound of wagon wheels crunching through snow. Men carried their wounded comrades toward the town hall, leaving trails of blood in the white snow. Inside the hall, chaos reigned. Injured miners lay on hastily arranged tables and blankets on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of blood and dust. James immediately began assessing the wounded, prioritizing those with the most severe injuries. "What happened?" he asked one of the less severely injured men as he cleaned a gash on the miner's arm. "Support beams gave way in the north tunnel," the man explained, wincing as James stitched his wound. "We've been telling the foreman for weeks they needed replacing, but Mr. Blackwell said it would cut into profits too much." James worked methodically, moving from one patient to the next. Martha and several other women from town assisted, bringing water, tearing sheets for bandages, and offering comfort to the injured. Hours passed as he set broken bones, stitched wounds, and did what he could for the internal injuries that were beyond his limited resources. As the afternoon wore on, the door to the town hall opened again. Sarah stood there, her eyes taking in the scene before her. Without hesitation, she removed her shawl and approached Martha. "How can I help?" she asked simply. Martha directed her to a group of miners with minor injuries who were still waiting for treatment. James watched from across the room as Sarah efficiently cleaned cuts and applied bandages, her movements sure and practiced. When he finally had a moment to speak with her, James couldn't hide his surprise. "You've done this before." Sarah nodded, wringing out a bloodied cloth. "My mother was a midwife. I assisted her for years. After she died, I worked briefly in a hospital in Denver before." She trailed off, then continued more firmly. "I know how to care for the injured." Together, they worked until sunset, treating over 30 miners. 7 had died before ever reaching town, and 2 more succumbed to their injuries despite James's best efforts. As the crisis subsided and the surviving miners were either sent home or made comfortable for the night, James finally sat down, exhaustion overwhelming him. Sarah brought him a cup of coffee, sitting beside him. "You're a good doctor," she said quietly. "Those men are fortunate to have you." "Not good enough," James replied, thinking of the men he couldn't save. "My mother used to say that medicine isn't about cheating death. It's about serving life," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "You served them well today, James." Before he could respond, the town hall doors slammed open. George Blackwell, the mine owner, strode in, followed by his son Frank and Sheriff Donovan. The elder Blackwell was a tall, imposing figure with cold eyes and a carefully trimmed beard that did little to soften his harsh features. "Where's the doctor?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the exhausted quiet of the hall. James stood, facing the man whose negligence had caused so much suffering. "I'm here, Mr. Blackwell." "How many?" Blackwell asked, not bothering with pleasantries. 9 dead. 34 injured, 12 severely. James's voice was clinical, masking his anger. Blackwell nodded, as if the numbers were merely inventory to be counted. "Sheriff Donovan will arrange for the dead to be buried tomorrow. You'll be compensated for your services, Doctor. I want the able-bodied men back in the mine by the day after tomorrow." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Even the sheriff looked uncomfortable. "These men need rest," James protested. "The severely injured won't be able to work for weeks if at all, and the mine needs to be properly inspected before anyone returns." "I don't recall asking for your opinion on how to run my business, Doctor," Blackwell replied coldly. "The mine will reopen." "No, it won't." The voice came from behind James. Sarah had risen to her feet, her face set with determination. Frank Blackwell's eyes widened in recognition. "Well, look who it is," he sneered, "the thieving whore." "That's enough, Frank," Sheriff Donovan interjected, but the younger Blackwell continued. "What's she doing here? Did you bring her in to comfort the men, Doc? That would be the only thing she's good for." James stepped forward, but Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm. "These men," she said, her voice steady as she gestured to the injured miners, "risked their lives because you valued profit over their safety. They have families who depend on them. They deserve better than to be treated as disposable. The elder Blackwell studied Sarah with cold calculation. And who might you be to lecture me on my business? Someone who recognizes injustice when she sees it, Sarah replied. Someone who isn't afraid of you. For a moment, the hall was silent. Then George Blackwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Sheriff, I believe this woman is the same thief my son reported earlier this week. Arrest her. On what charges? James demanded. She's committed no crime. Theft, trespassing, public indecency, take your pick, Frank Blackwell said with a smirk. I'm sure we can think of something that will stick. Sheriff Donovan hesitated, his hand not moving toward his handcuffs. Mr. Blackwell, given the circumstances with the mine accident, perhaps we could. Are you refusing to do your duty, Sheriff? The elder Blackwell interrupted. Remember who pays your salary. The tension in the room was palpable. James looked around at the miners and townspeople who had witnessed the exchange. In their faces he saw fear, resignation, and in a few a growing anger. If you arrest her, James said clearly, ensuring everyone could hear, you'll have to arrest me too. And then who will tend to these men? Who will write the report detailing exactly how their injuries occurred, due to unsafe conditions that you were warned about repeatedly? Martha stepped forward to stand beside them. And you'll have to arrest me as well. I've been harboring Miss Bennett at the church with Reverend Thompson's full knowledge and blessing. One by one, miners who were able began to stand or sit up straighter in their makeshift beds. A silent solidarity was forming, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the room. George Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. He was accustomed to power, to having his will obeyed without question. But even he could sense the dangerous undercurrent now flowing through the town hall. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow, when tempers have cooled, he finally said. Come, Frank. There's business to attend to. As the Blackwells left, Sheriff Donovan lingered, his expression torn between duty and conscience. You're playing a dangerous game, Doc, he said quietly. It's not a game, Sheriff, James replied. It's about doing what's right, no matter the cost. Isn't that what your badge is supposed to represent? The sheriff had no answer for that. With a nod that could have meant anything, he followed the Blackwells into the night, leaving James, Sarah, and the rest of the townspeople to tend to the wounded and contemplate what tomorrow might bring. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the sun reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered landscape. James had spent the night at the town hall, monitoring the most severely injured miners. Sarah had remained as well, moving quietly among the wounded, offering water, adjusting bandages, and providing comfort with a gentle touch or a softly spoken word. As James watched her work, he realized that in just a few days, she had transformed from a desperate woman on the brink of surrender to someone who radiated quiet determination. The change stirred something in him that he had thought long buried hope. By mid-morning, Reverend Thompson arrived with several women from the church, bringing food and fresh bandages. The Reverend, a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely white hair, approached James. Dr. Miller, he said, his voice low enough that only James could hear. I believe we may have a situation developing. George Blackwell was seen at the telegraph office early this morning. Word is he's bringing in men from Denver, not to work the mine, but to restore order in town. James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. When? The train arrives at noon tomorrow. That gives us a day to prepare. Prepare for what, exactly? James asked, though he already knew the answer. The Reverend's expression was solemn. For whatever comes next, the miners are talking, Doctor. What happened yesterday, both the accident and the confrontation afterward, has sparked something. They're gathering at the church now to discuss their options. James glanced around the hall at his patients, many of whom would bear the scars of Blackwell's negligence for the rest of their lives. I should be there. Yes, Reverend Thompson agreed, and bring Miss Bennett. Her words yesterday made quite an impression. After ensuring that the remaining patients were stable and in good hands, James found Sarah changing bandages for a young miner whose arm had been crushed in the collapse. There's a meeting at the church, he explained quietly. "The miners are organizing." Sarah nodded, finishing her task before standing to join him. "I heard the Blackwells are bringing in hired guns," she said, her voice steady despite the implications. "News travels fast," James replied as they walked through the snow-covered street. "People talk freely around a woman they think doesn't matter," Sarah said with a hint of irony. "It's one of the few advantages of being considered invisible." The church was packed when they arrived. Miners and townspeople crowded into the pews and standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension and the murmur of concerned voices. Reverend Thompson stood at the pulpit, trying to maintain some semblance of order. James and Sarah slipped in quietly, finding space near the back. Martha spotted them and made her way over, her face tight with worry. "The situation is worse than we thought," she whispered. "Blackwell isn't just bringing in men to intimidate the miners. He's convinced the territorial governor that there's an imminent threat of riot and destruction of property. If the miners strike or resist, they could be charged with insurrection." Before James could respond, a loud voice called out from the front of the church. "The way I see it, we've got two choices," said Thomas Hayes, one of the older miners. "We either accept Blackwell's terms and go back to work in that death trap, or we fight back and likely get shot or arrested for our troubles." Murmurs of agreement and dissent rippled through the crowd. "There must be a third option," another voice countered. "We could appeal directly to the governor, explain the unsafe conditions." "With what proof?" someone else interrupted. "Blackwell owns the territorial judge. He'll bury any complaint before it reaches the governor's desk." The debate continued, growing more heated as men argued between submission and resistance. James felt the hope that had begun to grow within him starting to fade. Without unity, the townspeople stood no chance against Blackwell's money and influence. "May I speak?" Sarah's voice, though not loud, somehow cut through the noise. People turned to look at the unfamiliar woman standing at the back of the church. Reverend Thompson nodded. "Please come forward, Miss Bennett." Sarah walked slowly to the front, conscious of all eyes upon her. James could see her gathering her courage with each step. "Most of you don't know me," she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "My name is Sarah Bennett. I've only been in your town for a short time, and I came here with nothing, no money, no friends, no hope." She paused, looking around at the faces watching her. 3 nights ago, I was at my lowest point. I was hungry, cold, and desperate. Frank Blackwell and his friends found me trying to take food from their storehouse, and they decided to humiliate me for their entertainment. They put a price on me, $7, as if a human life could be valued so cheaply. A murmur of anger ran through the crowd. Many had heard rumors of what happened at the saloon, but hearing Sarah speak of it so directly was different. "But someone in this room decided I was worth more than $7. She continued, her eyes finding James in the crowd. "Dr. Miller didn't know me. He had no reason to help me. But he did, because he understood something that the Blackwells never will, that every life has value beyond what can be counted in dollars and cents." Sarah turned to address the miners directly. "Yesterday, I saw the same disregard for human life that I experienced, but on a much larger scale. The collapse wasn't an accident, it was the inevitable result of valuing profit over people. And unless something changes, it will happen again. What would you have us do?" Thomas Hayes asked. "We've got families to feed. Most of us can't afford to lose our jobs." "I'm not suggesting you fight with fists or guns," Sarah replied. "That's what Blackwell wants, an excuse to bring in armed men and crush any resistance. But there's power in unity and in truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Before I came west, I worked briefly with a woman named Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, they called her. She organized miners in Pennsylvania to demand safer conditions. One of the tools she used most effectively was publicity. Newspapers in the big cities are always looking for stories of corruption and injustice. If we can get word to them about what's happening here, Blackwell won't be able to hide behind his money and influence." "That might work in the East," someone objected, "but we're isolated here. It would take weeks for a journalist to arrive, And by then Blackwell's men will have ensured there's nothing to see. We don't need the journalists to come to us, James said, stepping forward to stand beside Sarah. We can bring the story to them. He turned to address the crowd. I've been documenting the injuries from the mine for years. I have records of every man hurt or killed due to Blackwell's negligence. Yesterday, I examined 34 injured miners and pronounced 9 dead. I can write a detailed medical report that no one can dispute. And I can draw, Martha added unexpectedly. I can sketch the conditions in the mine, the injured men. The collapsed tunnel create images that will tell the story even more powerfully than words. Reverend Thompson nodded thoughtfully. I have a contact at the Denver Post, a former parishioner. If we could get our evidence to him, he would ensure it's published. The train that's bringing Blackwell's men tomorrow can take our messenger to Denver on its return journey, James suggested. I'll go, Sarah said without hesitation. I know Denver, and I know which newspapers will be most sympathetic to the miners' cause. A sense of purpose began to spread through the church as people offered what they could: information about the mine's conditions, personal testimonies, money for the journey. Even Sheriff Donovan, who had slipped in unnoticed during the discussion, stepped forward. I can't openly oppose Blackwell, he said, his voice low but determined. But I can ensure that Miss Bennett boards the train safely tomorrow. And I can look the other way while you gather what you need. As the meeting continued, plans taking shape with increasing clarity and conviction, James found himself standing beside Sarah near the church's small window. Outside, the winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow. Are you sure about this? He asked her quietly. Going back to Denver could be dangerous for you. Sarah turned to face him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. 3 days ago, I asked you why you helped me. You said it was the right thing to do. This is no different. It's entirely different, James argued. You don't owe this town anything. You could leave, start fresh somewhere else. And go back to being invisible? Sarah shook her head. You showed me that I matter, James, that my life has value. Now I have a chance to help others recognize that same truth about themselves. How could I walk away from that? James studied her face, seeing in it a strength and purpose that humbled him. When this is over, he said softly, when you've delivered our evidence and the story is told ... will you come back? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Sarah held his gaze, her eyes clear and direct. Is there something here worth coming back for? I think there could be, James replied, for both of us. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. James compiled his medical records. Martha created powerful sketches of the injured miners and the unsafe conditions they described. And the Reverend drafted a letter to his contact at the newspaper. By nightfall, they had assembled a compelling case against the Blackwell's exploitation and negligence. As dawn broke the next day, James stood with Sarah at the small train station. She wore Martha's warmest coat and carried a satchel containing the evidence they had gathered. The train whistle sounded in the distance, announcing its approach. Be careful, James said, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. Blackwell has connections in Denver, too. I'll be discreet, Sarah promised. And I'll be back as soon as the story breaks. The train rumbled into the station, steam billowing around the platform. Sheriff Donovan appeared from the station house, nodding to them before moving to greet the new arrivals, a dozen hard-faced men who were clearly not ordinary passengers. That's your cue, the sheriff murmured as he passed Sarah. Board at the rear car while they're distracted. Sarah turned to James one last time. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing value in someone everyone else had given up on. Come back to us, James replied. To me. She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face and kindled a warmth in James's chest despite the bitter cold. I will. That's a promise. As Sarah slipped aboard the train and it pulled away from the station, James knew that regardless of what happened with the Blackwells, something fundamental had changed in Redemption Creek. A woman who had once asked for her suffering to be quick had instead discovered her own power, and in doing so, had awakened something in an entire town. The struggle ahead would not be easy. Blackwell's men were already fanning out through the town, their purpose clear in their stern faces and the weapons visible beneath their coats. But for the first time in years, James felt something stronger than the resignation that had become so familiar. He felt hope, not just for himself or for Sarah, but for all the seemingly hopeless souls who had forgotten their own worth. And that, he realized, was worth any price.